Okay. Now, in last time's presentation, we studied about the beast that rose from the sea, right? And we noticed that that beast that rose from the sea is a symbol of the Roman Catholic papacy. Now, I want to make it very clear that we are not opposed to Roman Catholics people, right? We are talking about a system. We are not talking about individuals in that system. There are very many sincere, loving Christians within that community. But we're talking about the Roman Catholic Church as an organization and as a hierarchy. Okay. Remember also that we noticed that the fourth beast of Daniel chapter 7 has 4 stages of dominion. Remember that? The first stage of dominion is, of course, the dragon beast ruling by itself. And that represents the Roman Empire, the pagan Roman Empire. Then from the head of that dragon, the beast, came 10 horns, which represent the 10 divisions of the Roman Empire, right? The Roman Empire was fragmented as a result of the barbarian invasions. And then we notice that a little horn rises among these 10 representatives that the Roman Catholic papacy, that represents the Roman Catholic papacy, which ruled for 1,260 years from the year 538 AD to 1798 AD, when the Pope was taken prisoner by Napoleon's General Berthier. Right? And then we noticed that there was a period of time in which this little horn or beast remained inactive. Right? It was because the secular governments of the world maintained this system bound. Right? In other words, they didn't allow this system to use them. The Bible uses the symbolism of the sword. They did not allow the church to use the sword of the state. And so for the past 200 odd years, after the French Revolution, the Roman Catholic Church has not been able to use civil powers, the governments, their military of the world, to persecute people who don't agree to their theology or ideology. But we notice also in our study that this deadly wound is going to be healed, right? The sword is going to be returned once again to this system. And all the world, the Bible says, is going to wander after this system, or is going to wander after the beast. That's what Revelation 13 tells us. Now the question is, how in the world could this wound be healed? How is the wound going to be healed? How is it possible that any nation in the world would allow this system to once again to climb on it, on the country, and to use that government or to use that secular power as a sword to persecute once again those who are not in harmony with the teachings of the church, right? So we covered all of that in general. Now let's move on to the beast from the earth. So today we are going to study a little bit about the healing of that deadly wound. How is it going to heal? Who is it? Who is going to heal? We are going to identify a second beast in Revelation 30. This beast does not rise from the sea. It rises from the earth. And this beast is actually going to return the sword to the first beast. Now the seas we know are populated areas, and rough seas, churning seas, there is wars and tumults. So nations fight against the other and then get dominion over, like Babylon was defeated by Medo-Persia, Medo-Persia was defeated by Greece, and Greece by Rome. So those are what the seas talk about, populated areas that are always in conflict and turmoil. But this beast we are going to talk about today comes from the earth, right? So Revelation 13:11 describes a two-horned beast that rises from the earth, who will compel the entire world to worship the beast from the sea, right? The one that was wounded with the sword, right? And it will set up an image of it and to it. So they will set up an image to it. point and to it, and it will impose its mark. Right? We're going to study what the mark is. We are going to study that in future lessons, what this mark is, what all of that we will cover. But today we are just going to talk about the identify this land beast, right? So this two-horned beast will be the sword. The beast will be the sword in the hand of the papers. And we are told that it will kill with that sword everyone who dissents, who goes against, right? All it does will be to honor the sea beast, okay, the beast that rose from the sea. This power will restore the sword into the hands of the beast, so their military, their might, their judiciary will be given to the sea beast to use, right? In other words, now we find that in Revelation 13:15, where it says, shall we read Revelation 13:15?
He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed.
Okay, right? So persecution will arise again, just like it existed during the Middle Ages, during the 1260 years, just like, right? Now let's read about this beast that rises from the earth that is going to help the first beast. Now remember, the first beast is the beast from the sea. It's called the harlot. It's called the, the little horn. That beast has so many names. It's going to help that beast, right? And let's talk about how it's going to get its power back. And this is found, this description of the land beast is found in Revelation chapter 13, verse 11. Let's read verse 11.
Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon.
Okay, other versions say he had two horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon, right? Now what's remarkable about this second beast, this earth beast, is that it split personality. It has two horns like a lamb, but simultaneously, at the same time, it speaks like a dragon. So notably, the two horns are not broken off before it begins to speak like a dragon. The two horns are still there before it begins to speak like a dragon. It speaks like a dragon while it still continues to have the two lamb-like horns on its head. Now, the character of this beast is reminiscent of the split personality manifested by Dr. Jekyll, good, and Mr. Hyde, evil. So it has its good side and it is an evil side, but they coexist, if you could say. So in other words, it professes one thing, but it actually lives another. In other words, it professes two principles, and we're going to notice that Christ entertained these two principles, and it's going to say, we believe in that, but at the same time, it's going to persecute, like the dragon, that of Revelation chapter 12. Okay? Now we're going to notice in Revelation that the lamb represents Jesus Christ. So this beast has a positive side, that is the two horns like a lamb, right? But it says that this same beast who has two horns like a lamb, right, speaks like a dragon. So it is a lamb-dragon kind of beast, right? So let me ask you, what similarity is there between the dragon and a lamb? There is no similarity, right? At all. And yet in this one beast, you find these two characteristics. Okay? Now, so let's identify this lamb beast. Right? It's not a lamb beast, but rather a beast that has two horns like a lamb. So it's not a lamb. It's a beast that has two horns like the lamb. The horns are like the lamb, right? So let's follow the historicist order that we have studied before. Babylon is represented as a lion. Okay. Then Medo-Persia is represented as a bear with one side lifted. Then Greece is represented as a leopard with four heads. Rome as a non-descriptive beast or a dragon, can't be described because there isn't a dragon that in the animal kingdom like that. And then remember, it's still Rome divided. So this dragon, Rome, grows 10 horns, right? The 10 horns we know are Europe, the Europe as we know it today. So what do the horns represent? They come from the head of Rome. Remember, Rome had 4 stages, right? And Rome is the dragon beast. It represents Rome that was divided into 10 kingdoms as a result of the barbarian invasion, right? In 476, right? 476 is the key day. And that's when the last Roman emperor was disposed. Okay. So the papal Rome during its 1260-year stage is known as the Little Horn. Okay, the Little Horn is Rome in that during that 1260-year stage. Note well, this is only once again a continuation of Rome, the Rome, papal Rome, pagan Rome, the dragon, but it is in its different stages. It has different stages, right? The deadly wound stage of Rome, of the papacy, is when the secular governments restrain it. Now, right now, the secular governments have restrained it. They haven't allowed the church to ride on them, okay? But if you go back to the Middle Ages, at the end of the 1260 years, this papacy, this amalgamation of church and state, received a deadly wound, the Bible tells us. The sword that is used to persecute now turns, the papacy used the sword to persecute people. Now that sword turns against the papacy. So in other words, the sword is taken out of its hand and the sword rises against it and gives it a deadly wound. And after a while, this beast is inactive. Why is it inactive? Because it cannot control, it cannot persecute because it doesn't have the control of the government, right? So this sea beast is inactive because it has this deadly wound. But the Bible says that its deadly wound is going to be healed. Now, I want you to notice something very interesting about this beast. Okay? The beast is from the earth, right? Now, when the first beast falls, when the sea beast receives its deadly wound, at that moment, during that time period, this is when this land beast is rising, it's coming to power. Okay? So we have a chronological detail to know exactly when this beast is going to rise in its flow of history. So the deadly wound is healed by the land beast. Now the land is sparsely populated area. If the sea is highly populated area where there are wars and tumults, then the land represents in Bible prophecy an area that is sparsely populated. Okay, when this deadly wound was given. So this land beast that is going to give the sword back to the sea beast, and it's going to impose its mark of the sea beast. It's going to impose the number of the sea beast. It's going to make an image of the sea beast, and it's going to make an image to the beast. It's going to tell everyone to worship the sea beast. So in other words, everything it does, this land beast, is with reference to the sea beast. It's almost like it doesn't have its own identity. It arose for one purpose, and that was to return the identity or the ability to persecute to the first beast, because its ability to persecute was taken in 1798. So let's talk about this beast. One, it rises when the first beast received the deadly wound. Okay, let's read Revelation 13, verses 10 and 11.
He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with a sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon.
So immediately after it speaks about the deadly wound, right? Because it goes into captivity. Who uses a sword is the sword hits him that this captivity goes into he that kills with the sword is killed by the sword, right? Immediate after Revelation 13:10, it speaks about the deadly wound in verse 11. Now this will only have to be around the year 1798 when the first beast received its deadly wound, the first sea beast, right? Now, two, in identifying this land beast, the earth, like I said, represents a sparsely populated area. How do we know that? Because waters represent people, right? We have studied that. You get that in Isaiah and Revelation also. It tells us that the waters represent people's tongues and nations, right? So there are no waters, no winds of strife and war, right? And no savage beast. Now, the lion is a savage beast, the bear is savage, the leopard is savage, the dragon is non-descriptive. We haven't seen one like that, right? So, no savage beast to fight and conquer, right? To rise to power after fighting and conquering. Now, in Revelation 13:11, there is no reference to waters. There is no reference to winds of strife. In fact, this beast that rises from the earth doesn't even fight with any other beast. It does not rise in the midst of strife, in the midst of war, the winds of strife, which represents war. It doesn't have to conquer over any previous nation. It actually arises in a different place, right? So we are going to learn prophecy moves from the east to the west. So you get Asia, you get Europe. Highly populated during that time. So it rises in a different place. So it can't be Asia. It can't be Europe. Because if you read, how do you know this? Because if you read Daniel chapter 7, you'll notice that the bear was an Asian, the lion and the bear were Asian powers. Where was Babylon and where was Medo-Persia? Medo-Persia is Iran today and Babylon is Iraq. They are in Asia, right? And those powers rose from the sea. They came into power by war, by strife, right? And then prophecy moves from Asia, that is in the east, it moves towards the west, it moves to Greece, the leopard, and the dragon beast, which is Rome, right? Which are European powers, right? And those also rose from the sea as well. But this beast rises from the earth, which means it must rise in a different place than this populated area. Is that clear? Okay. Now let's go to the third one. Like I said, it rises further west than the other nations of Daniel 7. Because as we saw, prophecy moves from the east to the west. Okay? It's something that is important that we need to note. Prophecy moves from the east to the west. Because, like we said, the first two beasts are Asian powers, lion and the bear, and the next are European beasts, and they keep moving towards the west. So where would we find this beast? From the earth. Where would this beast arise from? They are moving towards the west, right? Probably it has to be further west of Europe, right? Further than Europe. And what is it that is west from Europe? North America, the United States of America. In fact, it's interesting that there are no waters. It rises from the earth. Now, during the time of the Pilgrim Fathers, America was sparsely populated. There were no people, only the Native Americans, right? And so because of the persecution in Europe, people fled to America for freedom so that they won't be persecuted. So America was sparsely populated, and the land represents that detail very well. Right, now let's move on to the fourth characteristic. So it can't arise in Europe or Asia because the beast that rose from the sea, Daniel 7:2 and Daniel 13:1 and 2, it rises in a different place, right? Like we said, it rises from another location, not the populated areas of Asia and Europe at that time, right? So it moved further. It has to be further than Europe. So that will be across the Atlantic Sea. Now, let's read a couple of statements. One of them is by Daniel Bernstein, who for many years was the Librarian of Congress. And he says this about North America. This was found in Science of the Time, October 1976. Let's see what he has to say.
The vacancy of North America was to prove to be its peculiar promise to the world. Emptiness was America's special fertility. Daniel J. Bernstein, for many years the Librarian of Congress in his 1975 Reed Lectures in London, quoted in Science of the Time, October 1976.
So another author said, this is G.A. Townsend, about the territory where this country rose. Remember, now we are identifying the land base, so let's read this, what he has to say, what Townsend has to say.
The history of the United States was separated by a beneficent providence from the wild and cruel history of the rest of the continent. And like a silent seed, we grew into an empire.
So the United States rose into power in silence. There was no winds of strife, no wars, or fighting other nations to become who they were. So it rose in the earth where there was hardly any people, and it rose around the year 1796. And this author says it rose like a plant, right? So the next characteristic is that this land beast, it rises like a plant in silence. Do you hear plants making noise when they're growing? No, they grow silent, right? Do you know that this word that's used, I saw another beast rise from the earth. The word rise that is used in the New Testament is used to describe a plant that grows from the earth. It's interesting that this historian that we just read, Townsend, says, in the last quotation, with a silent seed, we grew into an empire, right? So America grew silent. Then the sixth characteristic, it coexists with the first beast. The first beast is older. Okay? And this second beast becomes an ally. So they're contemporaries. They are friends, right, of the first beast. And it helps this first beast to recover its power. What was its power that it lost? Its power was to rule, persecute using the country's sword, which is its civil authority to persecute people. Okay, it will become the first beast enforcer, right, and help its wound to heal. It will force people to worship the beast, the image, and receive its mark. So it is contemporaneous or coexist with the first beast. Now, another point that will help us identify this power is that the first beast, that is the sea beast. When I say first beast, I'm referring to the sea beast, right? And this earth beast, they are contemporaneous. Okay? In other words, they exist at the same time. But the first beast is older. It has been in existence before the second beast, because the second beast rises after the first beast has ruled for 1,260 years. They exist at the same time. They're powers that are simultaneous in the flow of history. And the interesting thing is that this second beast actually helped the first beast, right? Like we learned. So usually when you look at the beasts in Daniel chapter 7, the bear fights the lion and takes his power. The leopard fights the bear and takes its power. And the dragon fights the leopard and takes his power. Now, in other words, every power defeats the previous power. But this is a very unusual beast, because in 1798, when the first power falls and loses the sword, the Bible tells us that the second power is not going to fight that first power, but is actually going to do everything possible to restore the power to that first beast. Strange, but true. That's what the Bible says. Now, 7. Later in its history, this is the land beast, it becomes a worldwide superpower, economically, militarily, that it has powerful weapons, and politically. Okay? Unbelievable. Revelation 13 also says that this power is going to be a worldwide power, and it's going to be a superpower, right? And it's going to, why is its superpower status so important? Because it's going to forbid not only its country, but the whole world, to forbid people from buying and selling, people who do not receive the mark of the beast. So it has to be a superpower militarily as well as politically, have enough a political clout to get the other countries also to impose that, right? Then the military power, it has worldwide military power. It's because it's going to kill everyone who doesn't receive the mark of the beast, right? Because a death sentence is issued, so it has to have the power. And it is also worldwide political power, because it says that everybody on the earth, all the world, marvel and worship the first beast, right? In other words, the second beast is the enforcer on enablement of the first beast. Now, the second beast is actually the sword in the first beast's hand. So it is the second beast power, military power, political power, that the sea beast uses to do what it wants, right? It's unbelievable, but it is true. And then 8, before it became a nation, before the land beast became a nation, it provided refuge for those who were persecuted during the 1,260 years by the sea beast. So in other words, at first, it had a positive side, right? So this land nation, before it became an oppressive nation, actually enforces the religion that enforces the religion of the first beast, was actually a blessing to those people who fled the old country, fled Europe to the United States to be free from persecution, right? That was immediately towards the end of the 1,260 years, when the church was, the true church of God was being persecuted. It says that when there was persecution going on, Revelation 16 verse 16 tells us that it says the dragon was spewing water. Waters represent wars, right? Conflict, tumors. Spewing water out of his mouth to drown the woman. We know the woman is the church. A pure woman is God's pure church. A harlot is an apostate church, right? We are told that earth then helped the woman. How did the earth help the woman? It swallowed up the waters of persecution that the dragon was spewing out of his mouth. So it gave refuge to the persecuted, right? So it helped those who were persecuted in Europe. And later on, what's going to happen with this nation? Instead of providing refuge for God's people, it's going to become a persecuting power. How things change, right? Now let's talk about the United States phenomenal growth. Okay. Notice that the United States started with its sparsely populated, just pilgrim fathers who landed there. In the year in the 1600s, in the year 1701, the United States had 2,600 inhabitants. So that huge country, small. Then in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, there were 2.8 million. In the year 1800, there were 5,236,000, right? That's around the time of the deadly boom. Okay, so it's growing, but it's growing silently, it's growing, right? That's what it said. In the 1900s, the United States had 76,212,000 inhabitants. Then in 1950, the United States had 151,325 inhabitants. And today, I just went onto the internet and checked. The United States has over 347,149,618 inhabitants. Has it grown? Has it become a superpower, a big nation? So since 1950, the population of the United States has doubled. As silent seed, they grew into an empire. No big noise, they started growing. Now question, is the United States a global, economically, militarily, and financially a superpower today? Right now, America doesn't look very superpower-ish, right? With Trump, it may not seem like they have any powers. They can't even control their country. They are having such a lot of problems. But remember, the Bible says it will be so. And we can expect that to take place. How? We don't know. How soon? You never know. But it will become, right? It will become, simply because it will eventually serve as the enforcer for that power according to Bible prophecy. And Bible prophecy is accurate. Okay? So right now, Satan is trying to put out a joint Bible prophecy by making America so we can laughable to the rest of the world. But the Bible says in prophecy that it will become, because it's going to be the enforcer to the sea beast. Okay? Now, let's talk about a beast. A beast represents a nation or an empire. Okay? And does a beast represent in Bible prophecy? It is universally agreed among students of the apocalyptic prophecy that beasts symbolize or represent kingdom. In the book of Daniel, the lion, the bear, the leopard, the dragon, the ram, and the he-goat all represent nations or kingdoms. So, beast, as a beast, has already been shown to be a symbol of a kingdom or empire. The rising up of this second beast must consequently represent the rising up of another empire. So says Adam Clarke in his Bible commentary. Okay, so now remember, Adam Clarke is not in the Seventh Day Adventist. He's a Bible commentator. That is what he says, right? That the beast has already been shown to be a symbol of a kingdom, right? If the first beast is an empire, then the second beast also has to be an empire to be consistent. Right? You can't have a beast that is empire and you can't have a beast that is not an empire. It has to be consistent. And prophecy is consistent. So the second beast is also an empire or a nation. Now, what do the two horns represent? What is this? What is the meaning of these two horns? How many beasts do we have? Now, I'm not talking about the sea beast and the land beast. We are talking about the land beast, just the land beast. But this land beast has two horns. So how many nations does this beast represent? It's just one nation, right? But it has two horns. Now, what do the two horns represent? Once again, Adam Clark gives this explanation, which is a very good explanation. Let's read what he has to say.
As the seven-headed beast is represented as having 10 horns, which signifies so many kingdoms leagued together to support the Latin Church, so the beast which rises out of the earth has also two horns, which must consequently represent two kingdoms. For if horns of a beast means kingdoms, in one part of the apocalypse, kingdoms must be intended by this symbol whenever it is used in a similar way in any other part of the book.
Do you think he's right? I mean, you have to be consistent, right? You can't say 10 horns of the dragon. Beast represents one thing, like the 10 major European countries, and say the two horns on this land, beast represents something totally different. The two horns on the head of the lamb-like beast, right? Lamb-like horns on this land beast or the beast has characteristics like a lamb that represents two kingdoms. So the characteristics are like the lamb that represents two kingdoms. Was Adam Clark correct in his assessment? Right? We can prove that he was. The closest biblical parallel to a lamb horn beast of Revelation 13:11 is the ram of Daniel 8. Let's notice verses 3 and 20 of Daniel chapter 8. We read verse 3 and then jump to 20 to get an idea what these two horns represent.
Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had two horns, and two horns were high. But one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kingdoms of Medo-Persia.
Was this one nation? Yes, it was, right? One beast is used to represent it, a bear and a ram. One nation, but it has two, but this one nation is composed of two kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians. So the Medes came first, they were the weaker one. Persians came in last, that's why they were higher, like the bear had a higher shoulder, right? It will be noticed that the ram represents one nation composed of dual kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians. The inevitable conclusion is that the two horns, like a lamb in Revelation 13:11, symbolize two kingdoms that exist side by side within a single kingdom. So it's one kingdom, but they have two kingdoms that exist within it. Now, there are many beasts in scripture that have horns in prophecy, but this is the only time when the horns are specifically identified, right? What kind of horn? For example, the dragon beast has 10 horns. That doesn't say what kind of 10 horns they are, they're just 10 horns, right? But with this dragon, it specifies. It says it has two horns like a lamb. So it's specifying that the horns are like a lamb, right? Now that is very important. Now the question is, what does the lamb represent? What does the lamb represent? Now remember, we are in Revelation. Revelation uses the word lamb 29 times, right? The word lamb 29 times. And 28 of those times, it refers indisputably to Christ. But does it also apply to Christ in this case? The only time where you might have an exception is here in this text of Revelation 13:11. So that must mean that somehow this one nation on its head will have two horns, which represent two kingdoms. And those two kingdoms are the ones that were recognized by Jesus Christ because the Lamb represents Jesus. 28 times that the Lamb is referred to in Revelation represents Jesus. This one time it doesn't represent, but it must be, these horns must be kingdoms that Jesus recognized, right? So the text makes it clear that two lamb-like horns are in antithesis or opposite to the dragon's voice, right? They're opposite, they're in antithesis, right? This land beast has two horns, like the lamb, but it speaks like a lamb, constitute the positive or the favorable side of this kingdom, of this land beast. While the dragon's voice, that it speaks like a dragon, right, is the negative side. So this land beast has two sides, a positive and a negative. It professes to believe in two kingdoms that Jesus believed in, but it contradicts its profession in actual practice. So it says one thing, but it does something else. Now in Revelation, Jesus is consistently described as being in conflict with the dragon. We know the original dragon is Satan, but right now Satan works through his representatives or emissaries in this world, right? But here the dragon with lamb-like horns and the dragon appear to be co-laborers. They are working together. Okay? Now, being that the two horns represent kingdom that Jesus sanctioned, the question is, which two kingdoms did Jesus, the Lamb, recognize? Okay. Why the horns are lamb-like? Right? Why are the horns lamb-like? Well, we studied this previously. Remember that Jesus says, render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and unto God the things that are God. Right? So before we answer this question, let us examine or summarize what we just studied so far so that we can understand. Right? The land beast represents a single nation. The two lamb-like horns represent the fact that in this one nation is composed of two dual kingdoms. So there are two dual kingdoms, right? And these horns are lamb-like. So they must represent two kingdoms that were taught and recognized by Jesus. Okay? Now, what two kingdoms did Jesus sanction in Matthew 22? We know that the two kingdoms that Jesus recognized are the kingdoms of Caesar. The kingdom of Caesar is a civil government. Okay? So we pay taxes to the civil government because we use the roads and we use, what the city provides. And the kingdom of God, which is on earth, the church, right? Which we keep apart, right? Now let's talk a little bit about the history of the United States. So Jesus recognized the state, the civil power, and Jesus recognized the church. Those are the two kingdoms he recognized, but they were not joined, they were apart, they were independent, right? Independent nation within this one nation. So let's talk about the history of America to understand whether they fit in with this characteristic, right? Question is asked, what kingdom arose around 1798 when the first beast received its deadly wound, which in its founding documents explicitly recognized the legitimate simultaneous existence of two kingdoms in one nation, such as Jesus believed? The answer is remarkable and irrefutable. Mrs. White states in the Great Controversy, page 440. Let's see what she has to say.
What nation of the New World was in 1798 rising into power, giving promise of strength and greatness, and attracting the attention of the world? The application of the symbol admits of no question. One nation and only one meets the specifications of this prophecy. It points unmistakably to the United States of America.
Now, the constitutional fathers, those are the men who wrote the Constitution for the United States. Men such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, those great men, right, of the United States. They arose around the year 1798 to write the founding documents of the United States. Founding documents is their constitution, their Bill of Rights, right? What rights do people have? The First Amendment, right? And they are known, these documents are known full well. These founding fathers knew full well three things, right? When they wrote these documents. They knew the history of the Middle Ages because they lived during that time and they saw the persecution and the people coming there, right? So they knew the history of the Middle Ages. In fact, they were living close to the years of the 1260-year prophecy. And it's sobering to realize that the Declaration of Independence for the United States, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were written and ratified just before the deadly wound was given to the papacy in 1798. So they put all those in place while the little horn was active, right? So they understood exactly what it was doing. The constitutional fathers knew that when the church and state were joined together, the inevitable result is the denial of civil and religious rights and persecution. They knew that automatic result of the joining of church and state was persecution. They knew all about the mechanism of the Inquisition and were well acquainted with the martyrdom of holy men such as John Huss, right? So they knew the history. They knew about John Huss. Let's talk about John Huss a little bit. Now, John Huss was held in human prison of Scholar, right, for months without due process. So something a little bit is going on in America, a little bit like that now, right? And he was accused by false witnesses that he had broken, right, civil laws, but he hadn't broken no civil law. He was tried only for religious convictions, not for civil, not for civil disobedience, right? So he was tried only for religious convictions of his conscience. That he was judged by the leaders of the church in the similar fashion. Remember what happened to Jesus by the Sanhedrin? Just like that, right? The Sanhedrin just judged Jesus and the religious leaders pronounced upon him the death penalty, right? And the church had to finally appeal to the civil power of Emperor Sigismund to ratify their death decree. This is of John Huss. And they knew that Huss was burned at the stake for nothing other than his religious belief. Now, with all this history in mind only, they wrote the American Constitution. So America, the colonial period was 1620. That's when the Pilgrim fathers went there, right? In the Mayflower, they went and landed in America. To 1776 was the colonial period when they were under Britain. Then the constitutional period was 1776 to the present, right? So we find that the history, the founding fathers knew the history of the church during the Middle Ages, right? They knew the history of the church during the colonial period. Now, the colonial period, we are going to learn about that. That is also similar to that, when people think that what they think is right, they enforce on another. People are not given the liberty to choose how to worship. Freedom of choice, the liberty to worship freely, right? And the founding fathers also knew their Bible. So let's go through that. Now, they knew the history of the Middle Ages. Let's read a statement from this very interesting book called Huss the Heretic. Now we are talking about Huss who was killed simply because of his religious belief. He was burnt at the stake after no due process. He didn't have a trial. Now it is written by an individual called Photius the Papist. In fact, this is the man who was sent to arrest John Huss. And actually, as he watched the way that John Huss was treated by the Roman Catholic Church, he actually came to sympathize with Huss as against the church that he represented. So let's read what Photius the Papist says in his book, Huss the Heretic, page 19.
After a short while, Huss was led out of his dungeon into a distant chamber, but his feet almost refused to carry him. He swayed as he walked. Listless and unused to the day was the light of his eyes. Deathly pale, his cheeks and loose what was left of his teeth, since leaven had fallen out due to the damp prison. The nails on his fingers were terribly long because he had been unable to bite them off for many weeks. Upon his skin was a crust of dirt which exuded an awful stench, and his otherwise brown hair fell in white ringlets upon his rotting and torn garb. His shoes had rotted upon his feet, and his shirt and loincloths had vanished. The rounded flesh which had covered his bones had shrunken and uh, shivered, and he had become a picture of woe without equal, unrecognizable to those who had known him before. Horror filled those who looked upon him, and pitying people prepared a bath for him, brought shirts and clothing, and refreshed him with strengthening food, for which he could only thank with tearful eyes.
Now, all this was because of his faith, right? He was not going to recant what he believed in. Can you see how wicked the controlling power was during that time? This is John Huss, just one, right? They say over 15 million people were killed during the Dark Ages, right? Then on page 28, we find this second statement that he says.
With the clock striking eight, and the bells tolling, the procession of bishops, cardinals, fathers, and deputies moved toward the church, where a chair had been placed for Huss, about which the seats of the gentlemen were arranged.
So he is brought there for the conviction of his conscience, freedom of conscience, the liberty of choice. Very important, right? The accusations were then read, none of which were a violation of any civil law, right? Now let's see what he says in page 41 of his book.
Huss said, God gave to Peter, his disciple, the key to open all hearts and the heaven of faith with it, but not the sword to slay, as you slay all those who do not accept your worldly doctrines and who evade them.
Now, after he presented his defense, this is Huss talking in his defense, the religious leaders shouted much like the mob that cried out for the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, did Huss understand what the sword is? He most certainly did, right? He understood what the sword was. He said, you haven't been given the sword. You have been given the keys to open the heavenly kingdom. You have been given the keys, the Bible, to preach for the heavenly kingdom. You know what the vote was that day for Huss? 31 votes found him not guilty. 31 not guilty. 11 was for excommunication. and 45 votes were for death. So the majority voted for Hus to die. Then he was taken to the emperor. Now the church cannot pass a death sentence. It's a church. So they have to go to the civil authority who had promised. Now the emperor had promised to give him a safe conduct back home, which is to Hus, right? But he broke his word, cannot be trusted. In fact, there was a count there, Count Slum. He spoke to the emperor as he was about to sign the death warrant for Hus. This is what Count Slum said. It spelled as Slum said. Let's read what he says.
Caesar desist from such doings. Caesar, Caesar, do not write your name with blood. But the emperor's ears were deaf and were further closed by the cardinals, bishops, and priests who crowded about him, kissed the hem of his garments, and praised his name when he seized the quill and wrote his name.
Wow. So Count Slum was one of the defenders of Hus. He pleaded with the emperor. The priest wrote the sentence and gave it to Emperor Sigismund, who signed the royal edict on July 5, 1450. And Hus was taken and burnt at the stake. Right? That's how it worked then. That's how it's going to work in the future as well. Now, the second one is the founding fathers knew the history of the colonial peace. Right now, that was during the Middle Ages. You would have thought people would learn from what happened. Now, let's see. Not only did they know the history of Europe when the church and state were joined together, they also knew the history of the colonial period in the United States before they become independent, right? There were many people who misunderstood or didn't or don't understand the colonial period. The constitutional fathers also knew all about the history, right? That began in 1620 when the Mayflower land, right? In America, when the pilgrims arrived in the United States. They were well aware that atheists, Jews, Quakers, Baptists, and others were deprived their civil rights. A civil right is the freedom to choose, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, right? This was deprived for them because their beliefs and practices didn't square with those of the established religion of the colony, right? Which was the Puritan or was the Anglican Church, right? Now, did you know that there were Sunday laws in the colonies? And if you didn't go to church on Sunday, you would be whipped. Now, this is in coming out from persecution. They come to America and this is what they're doing, right? If you didn't go to church on Sunday, you would be whipped. You would be fined. You would be jailed. And in the case of 3 colonies, you would be executed for not coming to church on Sunday. They were no better, right? Do you know that they actually cut off the years of Quakers for coming back when they had been exiled from the colony? If they came back once, they cut off 1 year. If they came back the second time, they cut off the second year. And if they caught them the third time, they executed them for their religious conviction. Okay, now these are the ones who were fleeing persecution in Europe. Do you know that the only people who professed to be loyal to the established church could occupy positions of civil government? And also the government paid the salaries of the ministers, that is the church ministers, interestingly enough. So the church and the state were joined together. As a result, you had persecution because they were not doing what they thought was right. Now, we may not know the story because we are over here, but there people know the story, for example, of Roger Williams. Now, Roger Williams arrived in the colony in 1629. He pastored the church there, but he started teaching separation of church and state. He said that there are to be 2 kingdoms in this country, absolutely, but they are supposed to be separate one from another because that's what Jesus taught in the teaching from the Bible. Are you seeing what the 2 horns are, right? Can you understand what happened? Jesus said 2 kingdoms in the same nation, separate from one from the other. So he's teaching, Roger Williams' teaching went like a lead balloon. It just fell. The founding fathers knew full well about how Roger Williams was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for teaching a strict separation of church and state. They knew how he had to flee from Massachusetts in late 1635 and early 1636 in the dead of winter, in the cold, right? In order to escape the wrath of the religious leaders. Why? Because he had been banished, and if they found him there, they would throw him into prison or they could even execute him. They knew, the founding fathers knew how he, Roger Williams, founded the colony of Rhode Island in America, Rhode Island, with its capital, Providence. And so the founding fathers knew the history of what happens when a church and state join together. In Europe, they knew what happened when the church and state joined together in the United States during the colonial period. And third, they knew their Bibles. Okay? So the constitutional fathers knew all three of these. They knew all about the trials, sentencings, and execution of Jesus, and the persecution that befell the apostolic church at the hands of the Roman state. So with all this information, let's see what they do. The founding documents. The founding documents of the United States are remarkable. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence affirmed that all men are created equal and that they have certain inalienable, unchangeable rights, among which are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Anyone, whoever you are, have this inalienable, unchangeable right. In 1787, the Constitution was ratified or approved, and in 1791, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was approved. Now, this happened immediately before the papacy received its deadly wound. Remember, papacy received its deadly wound in 1798. All this is taking place before that. God, in his providence, was preparing the next world superpower to appear on the stage, even as the first power was about to fall. An examination of the writings of the constitutional fathers reveals that they believed in the existence of the 2 kingdoms of the United States that were to remain forever separate. The church was to use the spiritual sword, which is the Bible, with the Holy Spirit to persuade through preaching of the word, while the state was to use the material or the civil sword to preserve civil order. Okay. Now, this new nation was established on 2 great principles. Now, during the Middle Ages, all civil matters were decided and enforced by the king, and all religious matters were decided and enforced by the Pope. The power flowed from up down. When the king spoke in civil matters and the Pope spoke in religious matters, the people simply executed or obeyed, right? Now, the constitutional fathers of the United States established a revolutionary system of government, which flowed from down up. It says a government of the people, for the people, by the people, right? No, let me get it right. Of the people, by the people, and for the people, in which citizens could enjoy full civil and religious liberty. The foundation and idea behind this concept was that the 2 kingdoms in one nation, each with its own sword to be used separately. So they had republicanism, a representative of civil government, a country without a king; Protestantism, representative religious government; a church without a pope. Okay? And this is one of the most revolutionary experiments in human history. This is why it describes the contrast between the system of the Middle Ages and the system that the constitutional fathers finally adopted and implemented. It's interesting to note that Mrs. White was born 29 years after the deadly wound. it's interesting to notice that she describes this idea, how she describes this idea of the founding fathers. This is found in the Great Controversy, page 441.
Among the Christian exiles who first fled to America and sought an asylum from royal oppression and priestly intolerance, oppressive church, were many who determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil state and religious liberty. Their views found place in the Declaration of Independence, which sets forth the great truth that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government, providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact administer the laws. Freedom of religious faith was also granted, every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Republicanism, a state without a king, and Protestantism, a church without a pope, became the fundamental principles of the nation. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity.
What is the secret and the power of prosperity of the United States? All the money they have, all the vast territory they have, the powerful military they have? No. The secret of the power of the USA is found in the two principles upon which it was established. When these two principles are repudiated or rejected, it will lead to national apostasy, and national apostasy will lead to national ruin, like what happened to Israel of old, right? They have to uphold, as long as they uphold these two principles, God will prosper that country. Right? Now, Mrs. White says in Great Controversy 442, the founders of the nation wisely sought to guard against the employment of secular power on the part of the church, with its inevitable result, intolerance and persecution. Right? Now, let's read what the founding fathers said. Right? Let's read three statements from the three founding fathers of the USA. Let's read what Benjamin Franklin said. He had an interesting way of putting this. And this is what he said.
When religion is good, I conceive that it will support itself. And when it does not support itself, and God does not take care to support it, so that its professors are obliged to call for the help of the civil powers, 'tis a sign I apprehend of its being a bad one.
So when the church can't manage its own and it needs the civil powers, it's a bad church, right? That's what he said. Then notice these words that are etched on the Jefferson Monument in Washington, D.C., right? These are the words that are written there.
Almighty God hath created the mind free. All attempts to influence it by temporal punishment or burdens are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship or ministry, or shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but all men shall be free to profess and by agreement to maintain their opinions in matters of religion. I know but one code of morality of men, whether acting singly or collectively.
So did Jefferson believe in the separation of church and state? He did. Did he believe in two kingdoms? Yes. separate from each other. Now, these are the words of George Washington, right? The words that he spoke at a Baptist delegation in August 8, 1798. Here, Washington says, if I could have entertained the slightest apprehension that the Constitution framed by the convention where I had the honor to preside might possibly endanger the religious rights of any ecclesiastical society, certainly I would never have placed my signature on it. And if I could now conceive that the general government might ever be so administered as to render the liberty of conscience insecure, I beg you will be persuaded that no one would be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny and every species of religious persecution. For you doubtlessly remember, I have often expressed my sentiment that any man conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinions ought to be protected in worshipping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience. Three of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson was actually one of the architects of the Constitution of the United States. Again, did these men believe in a two kingdom within one nation? Yes. Right? So, how many kingdoms do Christians belong to? The fact is that Christians are citizens of two kingdoms in the same country. We are citizens of an earthly kingdom by birth, and we are citizens of the heavenly kingdom by new birth. And we have an earthly passport that identifies our earthly country of origin, and we have a heavenly passport that the blood of the Lamb, which identifies us as citizens of Christ, heavenly kingdom, the church. Okay, quickly. Now, it has become fashionable today for Christian activists to say that the separation of church and state was established only to protect the rights of the church from the encroachment of the state. But just the opposite is true. The history of the Middle Ages, the colonial period, shows beyond doubt that the greater danger is for the church to try to use the state to accomplish its mission and not the other one. Frequently, Christian activists will say that separation of church and state appears nowhere in the Constitution. Now, this is true if we mean that the actual expression, separation of church and state, is not in the Constitution. Although the specific expression is found in the Constitution, the concept is clearly and explicitly contained in the First Amendment of the Constitution. Let's read that.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Okay. Notice the intent of the First Amendment is not to prohibit establishment of a church or a religion above another church or another religion. The word religion in the First Amendment is not preceded by a definitive or indefinite article. Clearly, the First Amendment in the United States forbids the establishment of religion, period. In this sense, their constitution clearly contains the concept of separation of church and state, because the state is forbidden to make laws that establish religion or prohibit its free exercise. Thus, the state can have nothing to do with religion except to protect everyone's right to practice it freely according to the dictates of their conscience. So, in other words, what the First Amendment forbids, it's not favoring one church above the other church or one religion above the other religion. The First Amendment prohibits Congress, that's the branch that establishes laws, right, from enacting laws that have anything to do with religion, period. Nothing to do with religion. That's not their concern. So the first clause of the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. The second clause of prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that means you can exercise your religion freely. They are known as the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. In other words, the government cannot tell you to worship in a certain way, and the government cannot forbid you to worship in that way that your conscience tells you to worship. That's what it's called, freedom of religion. Now, James Madison, who is also known as the father of the Constitution, had this to say about the Constitution and the relationship between religion and government. He said this, let's read it.
There is not a shadow of right in the general government to intermeddle with religion. Its least interference with it, religion, would be a most flagrant
usurper.
I can appeal to my uniform conduct on this subject that I have warmly supported religious freedom.
So what does he say? There is not a shadow of right. That means there is absolutely no right in the general government to intermeddle. You can't meddle in religion. That's not your concern. The least interference, right, with it would be even a little bit of interference would be a flagrant usurpation. That is, flagrant means it's strong words. So I must appeal to my uniform conduct on this subject that I have warmly supported religious freedom. Okay. Now in 1797, the United States signed a treaty. It's known as the Treaty of Tripoli. It was actually approved by President John Adams. And this is what the Treaty of Tripoli said, right? The government of the United States is not in any sense founded upon the Christian religion. Okay. This was only a portion of the treaty. In 1797, the year before the deadly wound was given to the Roman Catholic papacy, John Adams signed this treaty, which ambiguously states this, right? Now, we need to understand that it was founded upon the idea of two principles: separation of church and state, separation of civil matters from religious matters. But that does not mean that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. It was founded as a nation of Christians. Huge difference. It was not a Christian nation, but it was founded by Christians, right? It was founded by a nation of Christians. It's different to say that it was a Christian nation, then it says that it is a nation of Christians, where most of the people at that time were Christian. So it was a nation founded by Christians, right? Based on Christian principles. Some 3 years later, in 1802, a letter addressed to the Danbury Baptist Association, John Jefferson expressed his understanding of the two first clauses of the First Amendment by using the metaphor of the wall, which he most likely borrowed from Roger Williams, right? So it says Thomas Jefferson knew far better the intent of the First Amendment than those who boldly attempt to write it and interpret it today. Isn't it interesting? Let's read what he has to say.
Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
thus building a wall of separation between the church and state.
Yes.
Okay, so he understood that very clearly, right? That there were two different kingdoms within America. The First Amendment deals with civil liberties, thus encasing within the First Amendment to the Constitution, one of the founding documents of the United States. You have this idea of two kingdoms in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. You have the idea of separation of church and state. And it will be noted that the third clause of the First Amendment guarantees full civil rights. Civil rights means freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So what is it that is going to happen according to Bible prophecy? According to Bible prophecy, this beast, this land beast that arose from the earth, that at first sustained the idea that this one nation having two kingdoms separated, one from the other, the church and the state, where you could actually be a citizen of both within the same country, where Congress would make no laws respecting any establishment of religion or forbidding the free exercise. Prophecy tells us that this nation is going to reject those principles, because we are told in Revelation 13 that this beast had two horns like a beast, which were clearly identified what those two horns were. But what is going to happen in this country? It's going to reject these two principles, and it's going to speak like a dragon. So in other words, it's going to become a persecuting power like the dragon, right? Try to kill the child when the child was born. That was Rome, by the way, and Jesus. Like the dragon tried to destroy the woman in the wilderness during the 1,260 years. That was under Rome also. The same Rome at the end of time will recover the sword, and most unlikely of all nations will be the nation that will return the sword to the sea beast, will be the land beast, and once again start to persecute the saints of the Most High. So Bible prophecy tells us, as God has announced things are going to happen, they happen because God knows the end from the beginning. He does not determine them that way, but he knows that they're going to occur that way, because he knows he sits in an eternal present and he can see the future. My prayer is that in this final conflict, you and I will choose to be on the right side.